Hello, everyone. Welcome to 1.5 Degrees, the podcast where together we explore the science, solutions, and stories involved in the fight against climate change. I'm your host, Heidi Pan, speaking with the professionals behind the latest research, policies, culture, and innovations shaping our response to global environmental challenges. For today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray to discuss the intersection of social and climate justice, tools for eco-anxiety, the importance of ensuring eco-anxiety efforts are anti-racist, and more. Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray is a professor of environmental studies at Cal Polytechnic University Humboldt and an environmental humanist with a PhD in environmental sciences, studies and policy from the University of Oregon. In service of climate justice, she is the author of The Ecological Other, Environmental Exclusion in American Culture, and A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet, an existential toolkit for the climate generation. Dr. Ray's work has been featured in the LA Times, Scientific American, and more, and she is also a certified mindfulness teacher through the UCLA Mindfulness Awareness Research Center. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Ray. It's truly such an honor.
Thanks, Heidi. Great to be here.
Yeah, I know we've been in conversation for some time. I guess for listeners, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, students were clearly not doing very well in my environmental studies classes. I used to teach environmental justice, and so my main jam was bringing a justice lens to environmental stuff, which often was very disillusioning for students who sort of thought that environmental work and social justice work would happily run off into the sunset together. But in fact, oftentimes create a lot of tension and conflict between each other. And that's really the subject of my first book. So my teaching and my research was really around this question of, why are social justice and environmental issues hard to get on the same page? Mm-hmm. And so that's how I would teach. And that's the majority of what I would teach in my classes. And then over time, that was great. And I felt like I was, educating this generation of people around how to bring social justice better together with environmental work, thinking about the ways that maybe whiteness and privilege and power play into how we perceive environmental problems and solutions. And in general, with that disillusionment came sort of a sense of empowerment or new modes of how to operate in environmental spheres and areas. But somehow something shifted a few years ago. Students were not just more and more aware of social justice relationships with environmental problems, so they didn't really need that education the same way as much. They also were more and more despairing about the various intersecting crises in the world. What now we understand as the term polycrisis, this intersection of climate problems, racial justice problems, indigenous sovereignty problems, authoritarianism, all of these things all seem to be cropping up and more intense. And I think this generation was starting to think, is it just me, or is this worse than it was before? What power do we have to face this stuff down? And what kind of world are we going to inherit that's coming down the pike for us when we become adults and have power to do things like have jobs and affect change? And I think that was a legitimate existential crisis for young people that is not quite over yet. Starting to detect it. No, it's definitely not over. But I started to detect it about 2000, I'd say, starting at probably like 2013, 14, 15, around that time. And it prompted me to ask a very different set of questions for my students and for this generation, which was basically, what are the existential tools that they will need? Not just skills tools, not just mental analysis tools, not just how do you change a policy tools, how do you network, not just those very important tools, but kind of inner tools of how to get up, how to find meaning in your work, how to be okay despite terrible news, how to use the anxiety that you feel about your future to drum up all of this energy for fixing the problems. And, all of these things that many generations of people have asked and wondered about in other social movements, but hadn't really been passed on to this generation, many of whom maybe were facing this notion of existential threat to their future for the first time, perhaps, who had been more or less insulated from that, people from various forms of privileged backgrounds and legacies. So yeah, I turned to that question: what is the existential set of tools that they're going to need to take on this work for their lives, for the long haul, not just to, get ready for one big activist push tomorrow or one big policy change by next week, and then burn out and really drive themselves into the ground, but really sustain that kind of engagement in this work for the long haul and find joy in life and find hope, find all the other aspects of purpose that aren't just about achieving something in the climate movement one step at a time. And that really turned me towards the book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, which is written really for younger people and written for me to figure out how to deal with my students. I'm still using that exploration with students. I'm back at work after a year leave of absence, and it's really fun to bring the last year of doing book talks and thinking about this book solely into the classroom again. And yeah, this sort of question about what's happening inside themselves and their hearts and minds, not just what kinds of skills can we fill them into their brains and hands,
Yeah, no, that's so true. Like, I mean, I'm seeing a lot more people discuss this, which is really awesome, but just that aspect of equipping young people mentally also to just be able to handle these things is just as important in order to make sure that, climate work can be sustainable as, skills like networking and whatnot. So, I know I personally really appreciated this resource for sure when I first came across it. Like even, it's still an ongoing thing for sure, as you mentioned, just that climate anxiety. But yeah, no, it's so important to just keep that in mind. And yeah, I know I'm curious, like, I guess just, I mean, you teach environmental studies, and then I guess, like, how did you come to be interested in working with the environment and I guess teach about it?
Yeah, even going further back. Yeah. So this is a really good question, because I wasn't, when I ask my students what brings them to environmental studies, there's a pretty standard story. It's not always, and I don't want to, erase what's happening with more minority students, but the dominant story is, I grew up in the outdoors. I grew up camping with my mom. I grew up, cleaning up trash on the beach with my dad, or there's some kind of story about their childhood being kind of close to some what we would call nature or wilderness. And although I grew up in Los Angeles, and I had a background in having access to nature that was part of my childhood. I grew up in a city and with a huge amount of diversity and all kinds of city life stuff. And I would never have said that I had any kind of fetish or interest in nature or being outdoors. It's sort of a joke for me. I don't really like being dirty. I'm not a gardener, like all these, seem to be like environmentalist stereotypes are definitely not my background. I actually got my undergraduate in religious studies and women's studies outside of Philadelphia, and worked at a family reproductive rights center for my sort of undergrad experience, was really interested in abortion rights. Went off and did family law stuff in Los Angeles and South Central after college. So I had a kind of background in thinking I would go into like reproductive rights maybe, or something in the more social justice domain, and I really felt this sort of call to that kind of forms of social justice service. And I didn't quite know how to plug into that. So I ended up at graduate school, as you do when you don't know quite what you're doing. And there I met a person, Diana Davis, who I always think of as the person who turned me towards this field, who basically showed me that if I wanted to study social justice and intervene in social justice questions in ways that really needed a lot of work to happen, that the environmental field would be a really great one to do that. And I had no idea you could study the environment from a non-science perspective. So that was started off. She was a geographer, and her particular passion was around post-colonial stuff and political ecology. So her orientation was very much about how did green ideas or environmental ideas in the past justify colonial expansion into lots of different places. And so this was the beginning of me thinking, oh, environmental stuff is not always good for social justice. In fact, environmental have underwritten a whole lot of injustice and oppression and violence in the world. And so that was a really first big aha moment to start studying environmental stuff, was through that social justice lens, and actually quite a hefty critique of environmental stuff. So I never thought of myself as an environmentalist, which is interesting. And I think there's a lot of times this a shock from my students that I might be critical of environmentalism in the
Mm-hmm.
work we're doing. They, in general, have sort of grown up with this heady idealism about environmentalism being noble and pure and good. And when I start to share this history, it's often shocking. Which isn't to
Yeah.
say that I don't love the environment, and I don't think it's
Mm-hmm.
important that we do
Mm-hmm.
the environment, right? But it's just that there's these tensions that often go unexplored. So that's how I turned to environmental studies, really through this very much a humanities lens, very much a social justice lens, and thinking of the environment as not just a thing out there, but a
Mm-hmm.
set of ideas that operates through politics and power. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I actually really align with that. I'm very fortunate to have like a teacher in my school that, is very focused on these things, and she really highlights that, it's a very nuanced thing, environmentalism. Like it's not that idealistic painted like perfect movement that, it's yeah, no, that we tend to, ascribe moral things to, like good and bad or whatnot. But it's, yeah, no, just learning about that history, especially in relation to just Indigenous work, that was very eye-opening and something that's really important to learn. So yeah, no, that's super insightful. Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, I definitely also want to, I guess, like in tying back to the book, like you had mentioned at some point in the book also that you didn't exactly have like a, strictly psychology background in this. What were some, I guess, like challenges in writing about this kind of work, and what was some new things that you learned even in the process of it?
Well, that's a great question. I have no background in psychology, but the interesting thing there is that with religious studies, there's a passion there around what makes people tick, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
I realized, yeah, I probably should have done my PhD in psychology or something. That would have been really great. I didn't really want to go through, I had no interest in researching with people that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I now I love the secondary work, right? So how do I compile the work that's being done by actual psychologists
Mm-hmm.
to answer some questions that I might have just made assumptions about? Right. So we make assumptions that people generally don't respond to X types of appeals in environmental arguments, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to hear what the psychologists have to say about that, right? Conservation psychologists are studying that, and they do it in a kind of quantitative way,
Yeah,
And
no,
so it's really
definitely.
fun to go find that research. I have a great interlocutor who's a leader in conservation psychology, and I'll frequently email him and say, "Is there any research that says anything about X, Y, or Z?" And he'll write back saying, "Oh, the best stuff on this is over here." And it's
That's so
just really
cool.
been, yeah, I think that's part of being an interdisciplinary scholar, is that you have to get really excited about and okay with not being the expert in, and being kind of an interpreter of lots of different other people's primary research.
Mm-hmm.
So pulling together, primary research happening in lots of other different fields to put a secondary spin on it that maybe people haven't thought about or haven't put in conversation before is really what I think the benefits are of interdisciplinary work. And that's always been the kind of person I have, the research I've always done. My first book is like that. The second book is like that. And both of them delve into different disciplinary fields. You pull together probably 5 or 6 different fields to try to put them in conversation and see what kind of insights they can come up with that might be greater than the sum of their parts, And the second book for sure was about what's going to work, what's going to work for these students, what's
Mm-hmm.
going to work for some of them or all of them, what's going to work for me. And so I had
Mm-hmm.
a real purpose in writing that.
Yeah, no, that's so important to, like, in having that purpose in writing the book. And just, I also love going through secondary literature. I'm kind of, at the beginning of getting into student research and whatnot. But yeah, no, just looking at what has already been thought about and, using that to obviously inform where we go forward is, yeah. Um,
Yeah. So I
yeah.
used psychology, but I used environmental humanities. I used social movements, history. I used biography. I used what I would call movement strategy. So stuff that's being generated out of social movements that isn't really necessarily scholarly or academic.
Mm-hmm.
All kinds of stuff coming out of lots of different areas of knowledge and wisdom, even Buddhist tradition. These are not necessarily what one would have said when you're getting your
Mm-hmm.
PhD or doing a scholarly piece that count as forms of knowledge that you would integrate. But by the time I was writing a field guide to climate anxiety, I fortunately had, I mean, just behind the curtain look, I had tenure. I didn't have to worry about what kind of gatekeepers were going to call this real
Mm-hmm.
scholarship or not. And I wanted to write for a generation who was thinking about these things and make it useful. So that was, it had a very different purpose of writing than career advancement or being
Mm-hmm.
approved of by my scholarly peers, or is this real research, or is it rigorous, or any of that kind of stuff. I sure hope that one would look at the book and say that they are all those things too, but that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't the writing.
Well, that's so interesting. So I guess like, are you saying that it was kind of, I guess, I wouldn't say maybe liberating, but also just there were some limitations before this that, with this
Got
book
it.
were kind of different. I know certainly that definitely came through when I was reading the book. I mean, it was something I was kind of surprised by, but really appreciative of because, I mean, real life work is so interdisciplinary in itself. So that kind of
Yeah.
reflected that. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, that's so cool. I love the way you just put that, Heidi. Um, this notion that the disciplines are this artifice we've imposed on real life is a beautiful interdisciplinary insight. I couldn't agree more. I often say nature doesn't understand disciplines. What is that? Why do we say nature should only be discussed by the sciences or some, and even calling it that is a disciplinary, expression or disciplinary tool.
Mhm.
So yeah, life is not about, life itself doesn't come divided up tidy in little silos and disciplines where we can piece them apart and understand them through lenses assigned to them. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yeah,
It's
for
beautiful.
sure. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, and that's not to say that like, it's not important to, have specific research or disciplines, but you definitely that totally makes sense. Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Yep. Yeah. I agree with you. Thank you for saying that too. Yeah.
I do want to also like go into, I mean, you had written like a previous book before this, The Ecological Other, and on on the Field Guide to Climate Anxiety and the aftermath of it, you've previously stated that and I'm kind of I think I'm quoting this, climate anxiety amongst white people can go one of two ways. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it's like sometimes it will lead to like recognizing how climate change is, rooted in and at times worsens racism, or it will lead to fear and othering, like which you wrote about in the ecological other. And I mean, this is like something that I haven't really heard many discuss. Like, and in fact, it's something that does happen though. Like recently, I read about neo-Nazis using climate disasters to recruit new members. Like, I mean, I guess could you elaborate on why it's so important to, not only help address eco-anxiety, but also, ensure that it is anti-racist, and how exactly can we go about addressing eco-anxiety in an anti-racist way?
Great. Thanks. Well, there's sort of neuropsychological explanations you can go through, but I think I'll stick with the sort of political on this one. So the piece you're describing is the Scientific American piece that I wrote that they unfortunately titled something that I really don't love, which is climate
Mm,
anxiety is an overwhelmingly white phenomenon, which is not,
mm,
not my statement, and I don't actually agree with that.
mhm,
So unfortunately, the title is more about a clickbait situation,
mhm,
but okay. Anyway, moving on to the actual argument, which you just described much better, which is that climate anxiety, there's a long history, as I describe in my first book. The first book actually focuses on an emotion that I call environmentalist disgust. And so
mhm,
the ways that emotions lead to different kinds of politics and how they can tap into, and you can use environmental ideas as a way to rationalize other kinds of biases and emotions that you might be having, which is really what environmentalist disgust is about. So you could say, oh, I really don't like these immigrants coming into this country. Maybe I'll use it in a good environmental argument to
mm,
justify and validate and rationalize. And this becomes a sort of weird eco-fascist kind of confirmation
mhm,
bias thing. And that's what Ecological Other was about. I was really interested in particular in terms of immigration, and I rooted environmentalist disgust back to the history of eugenics and the tight links between the early conservation movement and eugenics, which I am not the first person to talk about. Many people
mhm,
have history. So I drew on that long history to say, look, this phenomenon of big environmental emotions, big emotions about nativism, xenophobia, racial purity, white supremacy, all of these big emotions oftentimes take on a green hue, what Betsy Hartman calls green hate.
Mm.
And this notion that environmentalism could be a way to make more palatable or make more politically acceptable what is no longer really politically correct is something that's still happening, still
Mm-hmm.
happening a lot. And lots of people are sort of thinking about ecofascism and how it's rearing its head again. In 2019, of course, we had two massive mass shootings that were
Mm-hmm.
based in climate anxiety. And so I wanted to, especially after Buffalo and in the racial justice movements surrounding George Floyd's murder, there was a correction in the climate psychology world. The world discussing climate anxiety was exploding at this time. The amount of interest around thinking about what young people are feeling and how their feelings about their future are going to make them seriously depressed and cause mental health crisis and all that stuff, which I completely agree with. That was the whole point of the reason why I wrote the book. But there was not a racial justice correction to that. And there was
Mm-hmm.
nobody saying, hey, while we're having all these big emotions, which are legitimate and grounded in reality, and we should feel sympathy about this. This is not, snowflake craziness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, while we're doing that and learning new tools, which of course my book is about, we also have to realize that these big emotions historically and currently are also can lead to great violence and bad things. And so while we're becoming more aware of the mental health dimensions of climate action, and we're also becoming aware of the role of different types of emotions in generating good and bad actions, right? Guilt, for example, doesn't generate great action in general.
Mm-hmm. For
Fear
sure.
can generate a certain amount of action for a certain amount of time, but it's not great for long sustained action. Anger actually is one of the best emotions for generating immediate action, but again, not sustainable for long-term
Mm-hmm.
action. So there's all these different studies of how different types of emotions relate to different kind of climate action. And it's changing all the time. The research on it's really great. However, anger and fear generate also forms of violence.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So there's a sense of the climate discourse getting co-opted by white supremacists to
Mm.
justify, and maybe not even consciously co-opt, right? It's just like, oh, that's another good reason I should have the fears I have, right? And the scientists are telling me I should fear this,
Mm.
So I would what some folks call ecofascism, green hate, this kind of use of climate discourse as a justification for violence, especially towards people of color. That was where that impulse was coming from. While we're turning our attention to all of this, the power of emotions and our climate action, let's be sure we
Mm-hmm.
mention how the action isn't inherently always good.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, just in starting to be conscious of this phenomenon and making sure that, anything that we discuss with regards to is conscious of that. Yeah, just repeated myself. But no, that's so
Yeah.
important. Yeah. And again, it's just really something that I haven't heard about before. So just thank you for sharing your perspective on it.
Yeah, and if
Yeah.
you're passionate about these things, and I love passion, don't get me wrong, but if you're passionate about these things, it's easy to get swept up in,
Mm-hmm.
and especially for students who have never really thought about race or ever thought about their own racial power, it might be something that they really could go either way. And in my classes, I do have students whose climate anxiety manifests in different types of maybe unconscious bias about different
Mm-hmm.
populations, or it can manifest in things like, oh, well, statements like overpopulation is the greatest problem we're having, which
Yeah.
has this long trajectory of inspiring all kinds of violence, right? And so the lack of awareness of that history is evident in a statement like that. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the kind of, I think that the correction for me is not so much about let's stop paying attention to climate emotions, it doesn't matter, but to say there's a long history of big white emotions taking green expression that has not necessarily been for climate justice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, yeah, I guess like this isn't relating to that. Like your book that it's not exactly a how-to guide, but it's more so, guidance and it provides tools. And I guess out of the tools that you provide, what is like I guess one tool maybe that you'd like to highlight that's especially important for the climate generation to, I guess keep in mind in terms of how to best politicize our angst?
Yeah. I think that the number one thing that dogs young people and the rest of us, not just young people, is a sense of powerlessness.
Mm,
And so I think that the chapter where I sort of critique individualism and try to put forward this, we're only, other people have made this argument, not myself, but the only reason we feel powerless and the only reason why we feel this kind of despair is because we have bought into the myth of individualism. If we actually did not see ourselves as these isolated islands operating through life, which is what Western capitalism epistemology would have us do, we would actually see that we are in fact part of this large community and not feel so isolated. And we'd be able to do things like take breaks, right? So the other thing I talk about in a chapter on burnout is if you saw yourself as a part of a large movement, you wouldn't burn out. You say, okay, while I'm resting, you take over this part because that just was really tiring. When I just had to do that translation work in this organization around what it's like to be a Black person doing environmental work, that really wiped me out. Can I tap you in now and you help me out now with this other work? So there's a sense of awareness of collectivity that is probably the greatest tool to sort of inoculate against burnout, to help us not feeling despair, not make us, even the research on this is where I love looking. What's the psychology research on this? The research on this is super interesting, that it's not the feeling of being accomplishing any tangible achievements in the climate movement that makes people reduce their climate anxiety. It's actually aggregate it and study it. It is the feeling of being a part of a collective. So we can have all kinds of terrible things happen to us, but if we don't feel alone, we can handle it a lot better. And so there's sense of community and collectivity is the number one inoculation. And many communities who are not the dominant communities have had to cultivate this over time and do not have the same sense of isolation. It's very much a product of the kind of privileged mindset of being able to afford that insulation and isolation. So I think that the collectivity that has been part of many wisdom traditions and activist movements for a long time is now needed for a larger population of us. And the second thing I'd say as a tool to inoculate against that, what psychologists call pseudo-inefficacy, which is that perception that I'm powerless, even though it's not necessarily true, actually has to do with becoming aware of the stories that we live in. So the vast majority of us, because of the negativity bias in our brains and the negativity bias of news, which are together, right? The demand creates the supply, right? And it gets feedback loop, of negativity in the
oh gosh,
I think there's negativity in the world and I'm going to go pursue it in my news sources, right? So if we look at sort of mainstream kind of global news sources, we often can feel like we live in a story of what Joanna Macy calls the great unraveling, that everything's just unraveling and falling apart and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And that is really a profound source of great anxiety and actually the source of a lot of the anxiety driving white supremacy right now too, right? We got to make America great again, right? Like things are really bad. Is the same exact doom and gloom kind of archetype that climate activists often are living into, right? That there's urgency, we got to act right now, forget deliberative processes that might include more voices, right? There's the urgency thing is a real manufactured kind of disaster politics that we have to be careful about. So living in a very, very different story and cultivating, pursuing, looking for, when you are in charge of disseminating stories, let's say on social media, which we do all the time, just by liking something, we're participating in the story making of the world. So, really being cognizant and paying really close attention to the stories we're consuming, creating this like ecosystem of nervous system and action in our lives, and the stories that we're reproducing or disseminating or producing in the world to make sure that we're living in more of a story of what Macy would call the great turning, so that we realize the pseudo-inefficacy becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we're living in a story, the apocalypse is on the horizon, our actions actually will create that outcome.
Oh gosh.
Right? So the story is critical, right? It doesn't matter what's really even true at this point, although I wouldn't say I'm post-truth. But this notion that we should actively counterbalance the truths that are in the news that we see with other truths that just don't get covered in the dominant media. This question, what else is true besides the way dominant media wants to tell me the story? And when we look around our communities, we see all kinds of models and examples of people creating great solutions We see, people organizing and having success everywhere. We often don't hear in history stories or in books about how people prevented or rehabbed a particular ecosystem, prevented a terrible thing from happening. So unearthing some of those stories about the successes of different activist movements. There's all kinds of ways that you can go about finding different kinds of stories to live in. So yeah, that would be the second thing.
Yeah, no, you touched on so many important things there. I mean, just first off, that like negativity bias, I know definitely that I will catch myself, like just having a moment because of because of all the headlines. But I mean, and even in speaking with a lot of fellow climate activists and just people that are working in this field, like they've all pointed to a big thing, which is community. That is what helps them with that. And I'd also just love to read those studies because I think this is something I would like to learn more about in general. Because I'm like trying to, help raise awareness, but in that I feel there's like a responsibility to make sure that like it's difficult to balance, do we incite, worries because it seems almost inevitable at times if you're learning about a big crisis like this, but at the same time, that might incite like doomerism and all those things that, might be very counterproductive and harmful at worst. So, it's just so important to be aware of all those things. So just thank you for that.
The fear response. I mean, this is where so the work of folks like Catherine Hayhoe is really helpful when she talks about it, and people like Renee Lertzman and all kinds of people have talked about this. But the use of fear as a tactic to get people to change their thoughts, beliefs, or actions can be effective, and so in some cases it sort of depends on your rhetorical context. If you're dealing with a particular audience in a particular rhetorical context, it might be really effective. If you're dealing with a different kind of audience, it might backfire on you. Another audience might go become eco-fascist, right? Like there's it's really, really varied. And so punchline in the book is we ought to know how these different emotions might work in these different contexts, be more thoughtful and researched about it, and then be more strategic about it. Not that we can control the emotions of people who we're engaged in a conversation with, but that there are certain psychological patterns that we might want to just be aware of and avoid, or try to engage more in people. For example, for the very, very most part, what neuropsychologists have found about humans is that our brains tend to go towards things that are pleasurable. So whether that's our cell phones or chocolate or whatever it is, everybody, pleasure tends to drive behavior way more than a lot of different emotions, for better or for worse, right? And so the desire for immediate pleasure means that our brains oftentimes override other forms of rational, we should be doing X, Y, Z for our common good, or for our health, or for better, longevity. I shouldn't have that chocolate, right? Like our desire for pleasure, right? A lot of that, right? So knowing that we're pleasure-seeking machines, how might the climate movement deploy that a little bit better?
So interesting. Yeah, no, the psychology perspective definitely gives a lot of key insights that we should all be aware of for sure. And I also, I mean, in speaking about just eco anxieties and climate emotions, like I'm curious as to, like, I guess, like, what are your experiences with climate emotions, and how has that, I guess, influenced the work that you do?
That's a really good question. Don't go there.
Oh gosh, if we don't want to go there, we don't need to.
We don't have all day, do we? Well, so I'd say that probably denial is the number one emotion I spend most of my time in. And I don't mean that in like a self-critical way. I mean that in the real true psychological definition of it, which is that when you're trying to deal with cognitive dissonance, when you're living when two truths seem to be, in conflict for you, the elegant solution is usually whatever's the easiest thing. And that for me is denial. And I was raised in a very much disposability culture, very much individualism. I'm full capitalist, colonial, Western individual mindset from my childhood. And so, and the culture I lived in LA, I'm not going to say all of LA is like that, but it's kind of LA too. And I really have had to actively work to think about my relationship to the world that way.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
it's been challenging, and it has caused a lot of distress and anxiety. And so there are times when I can really face up to it and get into it, and then times when the easiest thing is just denial. And but so the other side of that story is, though, that since I started turning to this research, it has affected far more than my climate emotions, right? It's affected all of the whole package, right?
Yeah.
Like my whole life, like I didn't know about psychology. I didn't know all this stuff about mindfulness. I didn't know all this stuff about emotional intelligence, or whatever you want to call it. And then all of a sudden it's completely changed the glasses I'm wearing as I walk around my life. And so I'd say being more comfortable with uncomfortable emotions, that's a practice I keep working on. So instead of denial, leaning into uncomfortable emotions is a practice I'm now more comfortable with. Stuff like that, right? So climate emotions, especially when I think about the overwhelm of the scale, scope, and time frame of disaster. It is completely debilitating. And so I would say I'm operating in a constant dance between the debilitation and okay, how do I make sure I'm innervated and energized and resourced to do this work? And so when I say this work, I'm not on any front lines. I'm not in any kind of disaster relief setting. I'm not even in a traumatic situation myself by any stretch of the imagination. So when I say this work, I mean getting up and feeding my kids, getting up, living my, privileged life, getting through the day, being busy with work, trying to run around, trying to teach students, all the things, do talks like this. This is delightful work. And so I have to make sure that I'm appreciating it. So I'm sucking the most energy from it, and so the gratitude practice of my life is part of the way I'm resourced. But my hope is that this research and this work and my ability to show up for it means that it supports other people's energy who might be more close to traumatic situations, or ultimately are training up to go do more frontline work as an activist, or as some other kind of person who's doing that work. So yeah, I navigated frequently. I have 2 little kids. I think about the planet they're going to inherit. I certainly think about what's the message I want them to be getting out of this based on the research I've just done, and trying to tell my students. Do I want my kids to live in doom and gloom? But there's the opposite of doom and gloom is not denial of the truth. The opposite of doom and gloom is a much more comfortable recognition that bad things are really bad. We got to keep getting on with life, right? I think that this is where the insights from people who are in religious traditions, especially Buddhism, are thinking about facing mortality and accepting death as a real practice around climate anxiety. Death denial, terror management theory from Ernest Becker, and a bunch of other people who are talking about the role of death denial in causing our inability to face up to the climate crisis has been a real part of inspiration for me. And I don't mean that as a gloom way, like you have to face it, will kill you. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying very empowering to let go of that it should be any different than bad. And so once we accept that it's bad, then we can maybe get the kind of shock and horror of that out of the way, or debilitation or denial out of the way, so we can roll up our sleeves and get to work.
That's so powerful. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I never thought about it that way, and I definitely want to go pursue more of that frame of mind. And even, I mean, just practices like practicing gratitude and I mean also mindfulness, right? Like that, thank you so much for sharing all that. Yeah.
I mean, I'm open. I'm still learning this stuff, Heidi. I don't know. It might be something completely wrong, but based on the research I've done so far and this exploration and this work for my own personal self too, probably that's where that these insights are coming from. As subjective and limited as they might be.
No, but yeah, I mean, I guess that's a worthy disclaimer. But no, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all sharing our own experiences in this, and it's, but I mean,
true that. That's so true. That's all we got, right?
We're doing our best, and no, honestly, just all of that really resonated, and no, that was just all really, really great. I have so much respect for that. Yeah, and I mean,
if you at your
yeah.
age figure some of this stuff out, you're gonna be like a billion leaps and bounds and leagues ahead of me by the time you're my age. So.
Oh gosh, no. Yeah, I mean, actually, I was gonna ask about just what you think of, younger generations. And I mean, you yourself, you said you have young children. Like with the like with climate movements, I mean, sometimes there's a lot of like, I mean, sometimes my generation is, receiving like it's on the receiving end of some preconceived notions. I guess like, can you go into why it's important to maybe, I don't know, like I guess empower, what you call the generation of or climate generation instead of writing us off, and how is it possible to, or what advice do you have for empowering students?
Yeah, it's a big unwieldy question, because of course the first thing most young people would say to me is, I don't want this responsibility. No,
Yeah.
I want to live that hunky-dory life you lived when you were a teenager and you're just worried about, crushes or whatever, like it's just so I respect that, um and more students are themselves not just in a privileged position of being an American college student, but are increasingly encountering climate crisis in their lives.
Mhm.
So it's not just a kind of hypothetical worry where I'm trying to get them to care about somebody else.
Yeah.
Um, it was maybe in early days when students in environmental studies were not necessarily thinking about the suffering of others. They were thinking about the suffering of panda bears or something, or
Mhm. Yeah.
so we're in a completely different moment where students are legitimately not just thinking about the suffering of polar bears, but they're connecting it because they're getting taught systems theory with the suffering of, different populations and communities across the world, not
Mhm.
even anywhere near the polar bears. Um, so there's a real awareness happening with this generation, which I think is really great. If you look at the statistics on climate concern and climate action awareness, climate literacy, we'll just call it that,
Mhm.
young people are something is going really right, you know. But the thing that's going really wrong is that the emotional intelligence correction to that climate education has not caught up at the
Mhm.
same rate. So that's just classic.
Yeah.
Yes, bring climate education into all the K through 12 schools. 65% of American parents want that. So we should be doing that. Great. That's under threat too, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. But I think that the skill set around inner resilience, the necessity, the absolute utter survival necessity of joy, the relationship between hope and grief, that they're so tightly tied, love
Mhm.
and grief tightly tied, right? There's just so much emotional valence to not just what's happening with the planet, but what's happening in their lives in general, even if they don't
Yeah.
even know about climate change. They're not getting this kind of emotional intelligence training. And we wonder why we have huge rates of mental health crisis among young people.
Mhm.
The vast, I mean, if you listen to Jean Twenge, she's a person who's written about the role of social media in
Mhm.
the mental health crisis of young people. She would say 100% is social media, social media, social media, social media. And
Mhm.
I'm pretty convinced by her arguments when she's asked about, well, what about climate change? What about other sources of their distress? She will actually say, um, that's not as big of an issue as social media. And she has some pretty good arguments for that.
Mhm.
However, young people are more concerned about climate change than any other generation. So you asked, how do you inspire hope? Like, what's this trick, right, with this generation? Well, first of all, we've gotten so far by getting them to care so much about climate change and whatever successful ways that happen. But for them to then use that knowledge to get completely turned off or not want to face it or not want to engage in it, or to worst case scenario, turn into eco-fascists, right?
Mhm.
Would be really terrible. It would be like such a wasted opportunity. So
Yeah.
there's a real sense of emboldening students with these tools, young people, not just students, but young people, to say, your generation is the most diverse generation that the US has ever seen. It's the largest generation that the US has ever seen, even bigger than the boomers. It is a
Mhm.
generation less economically well off than the generation before it for the first time in American history.
Mhm.
There are some real, demographic qualities to this generation that are unique and exciting and critical and important. The timeline for most important action around climate change is in this generation's immediate next part of its life, for better or for worse. And so there's a real purpose for getting organized and getting motivated. And that is a burden too. However, in my childhood, when I was that generation, when I was that age, I'm Generation X. There was nothing. It was very much like the generation of ennui and like no global purpose and nothing mattered. And, and I'm not trying to say I'm feeling sorry for myself for having nothing. I would have liked climate change to be the thing that I was facing then either. But that there's a sense of a reason to get up and get organized in the morning. And this myth that somehow we are entitled to a particular way of life is something that I think this generation is really rethinking. And I can't wait to see what happens for the next generation. Once that shift is happening, I really do feel like there's a rebirth happening, and this is a generation who's making it happen. And so it'll be very interesting to see where that ends up in terms of when they get power and mobilize as a block and start having the next generation, and what new ways of being in the world that come out of that. It's going to be, I think, pretty awesome if we can harness this and not lose them all. I do genuinely worry about the mental health crisis of this generation. So
yeah, no, that's something on my mind. I mean, from the inside, I guess, perspective, for sure. And actually, it's so funny you mentioned Jean Twenge. Like, this is totally a side note, but like in class, we're literally reading her book Generations. Yeah, no, this is all very much resonating right now. Gosh,
well, you should listen there in the 42nd minute of her Ezra Klein interview on Ezra Klein's podcast. She talks about climate change, and I was like on the edge of my seat, like, what's she gonna say?
Oh gosh. Yeah.
So anyway, it was interesting. Yeah.
No, but yeah, I guess like on the subject of that, I guess like just, I mean, your book first and foremost is an incredible resource that, I've been reading myself, rereading often and sharing. And yeah, so definitely I recommend listeners to check out your book. But I guess like in terms of, we're pretty much about sharing resources in this podcast, I guess. Are there any resources in particular that you would recommend listeners refer to?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that there are other great books out there. I think, Jaquette Ray's just written Generation Dread. There's a fantastic series of books like It's Never Too Late. The new edited collection that's come out, All We Can Save, is a fantastic book. I'm teaching It's Not That Radical by Michaela Loach. All of the work of Adrienne Maree Brown, I'm always advocating for. And yeah, I think that the Adrienne Maree Brown approach to thinking about pleasure activism and feelings of enoughness and small is all, these are all just such beautiful insights that whenever I've taught them or shared them with people, they've really had an impact. So yeah, I think I'd say finding community, whether it's virtual or in person, is the number one thing to do, and that can be the Good Grief Network. They do a great climate grief collective thing, and actually Laura Schmidt and Amy Lewis Rude just published a great book called How to Live in a Chaotic Climate. I think that's the title. Yeah. It's fantastic. I really love their new book. I recommend it highly. And yeah, I know I'm missing some really great books there, but I'm a little bit of a book. And I have to say that the thing about books for me is that they're like therapy for me. I'm not, I don't want to talk to somebody. I'd rather talk with a book.
No,
don't get me wrong, I love talking to people too.
No, yeah. No, I get what you're saying though. Yeah, no, I have, oh gosh, I have an extensive list of to reads, and a lot of those books that you just mentioned are on there.
If I start to try to imagine reading, like finish then I get too anxious.
Yeah. Oh gosh. But yeah, no, thank you so much for recommending those. I'll be sure to link everything, and of course your book as well.
Entangled. This is a book did I just finish it yet? Have I finished it? Yeah, I finally finished it.
Oh yay.
Master's Tools by Anthea Lawson. It's really, I mean, it's like you wouldn't think, but the book cover is I'm sorry, Anthea, not great. I don't mean to insult, I don't know, Anthony, I'm just apologizing. But it is fantastic. And Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Ochoa de Oliveira. I think, Andreotti is her married name, so I think of her as Vanessa Andreotti. Has published a book called Hospicing Modernity that I find really great. She has a collective she works with called Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, and you can go on their website, and just download all their tools, use all their tools. Movement Generation also has an extremely well archived set of tools that often I think are really useful even in classroom settings, but for sure around developing community, taking social action, that kind of thing.
Oh my gosh, I'll definitely personally check that out for sure. Thank you. And to wrap up, because I realize we've been speaking for a long time, thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, so I guess like if this is something I ask every episode, if you could turn back time without butterfly effects or whatnot, but just tell your younger self something, what is some advice that you would give them?
Oh, wow. That's such a nice question. I wish I had more time to think about that one. But yeah, I'll think about that one for some time. Thanks, Heidi. I think probably something like something about don't waste any time worrying about stuff that doesn't matter. Yeah.
That's good advice.
Yeah. And I think I spent so much of my childhood and young life worrying that I wasn't going to be liked, and that, I spent so much time wasting my time thinking about what other people perceive me to be, whether that was bosses or graduate, when in graduate school, I worried about my mentors, undergraduate, worrying about my professors or peers, high school, worrying about my peers and teachers, parents, all these other people's voices and desires for me were what I operated on. And it's taken me years to realize there's somebody underneath all that I probably should get to know. And who cares about all that stuff? I'm on my deathbed, it'll just be me. So
Oh gosh, that's true. Yeah, no, oh my God. I've been writing like a letter to my past self for this like exercise, and the whole thinking. Thank you for that advice. Yeah. And
wow,
also
that's a powerful activity. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. And oh yeah,
A
also
healing activity, right? You're like healing your own inner wounds from your
oh
childhood by
gosh,
doing that.
for sure. I love self-reflection, as difficult it is sometimes. But it's so important. Yeah. Yeah, but
Well,
also
running away from ourselves is the main reason why capitalism is working, right?
oh gosh. Oh dear, I could go on for a while about that too.
That's Jenny Odell's argument. I love Jenny Odell's work, How to Do Nothing.
Mhm.
Her work on that has just been
Yeah,
like,
no, her
wow.
work is great.
Economy, running away from myself, running away from discomfort, and running away from ecological crisis. Yeah, that's why I'm on my phone.
Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Yeah, no, I do that sometimes. I have to admit that. But yeah, no,
It's
your
okay.
breaks are important.
Forgiven.
But yeah, also for listeners, that want to keep up with the work that you're doing, where can they find you?
I do have a profile on Twitter and Instagram that I don't actively upkeep, but just because of exactly Jenny Odell's arguments about my life. That's at Jaquette Ray, and then or at Sarah Jaquette Ray for Instagram, and then for my website is www.sarahjaquetteray.com. That's pretty easy, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Sounds good. Yeah, no, and I'll be linking everything. And just thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I learned so much from our conversation.
Thank you for having me, and nice to talk to you, Heidi.
Yeah, no, likewise.
Really great questions. So yeah, it's so fun to hear your questions because it gives you a window into your soul. So